On behalf of the Irish chapter of the Network in Defence of Humanity, we denounce the recent manoeuvres by a small, unrepresentative group of right-wing MEPs to propagate the latest set of US-sponsored lies about Cuba. And we call upon all Irish MEPs to do the right thing and to oppose this motion, and to do so very publicly in furtherance of the truth. This current batch of lies focuses upon a so-called cultural and artistic movement, which is actually the antithesis of culture and is in fact a very mercenary gabble of people who are provably linked to the US-sponsored terrorist groups that have murdered over 3,500 people in Cuba, and who are calling for the military invasion of the island and indeed the continuation of the US blockade of Cuba. We hope that Irish MEPs and the Irish people more widely will be able to see very readily through this pack of lies. It's of particular interest, I think, to people in Ireland that members of this mercenary group have recently been on hunger strike, so they claim. I would think that the Irish people will know what a hunger strike is and what a hunger strike looks like, from Terence McSweeney to Frank Stagg to Bobby Sands, and that hunger strikers do not, as is the case with one particular bloated clown who has claimed to be on hunger strike, they do not tend to put on weight during the course of a strike, and they are not photographed as a local laughingstock by their neighbours, ferrying bags of food to and from their home. Nor do hunger strikers tend, as is the case with another of these mercenaries, to perform for the cameras and to have their hunger strike as a so-called piece of performance art. So I think Irish people in particular already have the kinds of historical and political education necessary to see these lies as lies. When it comes to human rights violations in Cuba, the foundational, ongoing cause of human rights violations in Cuba is the US blockade of the island and its people. Right from the very start, over 60 years ago now, the US State Department said, and these are its own words, that the blockade is designed to bring about hunger and desperation for the Cuban people. Hunger and desperation. Ireland has its own historical experience of an empire just off its shores, using tactics of hunger as a weapon of war, leading to the catastrophe of An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. So Irish people have a historical debt and obligation to call this kind of thing out, because it's ongoing now against Cuba and the Cuban people for over 60 years. That is what the European Parliament should be attending itself to as a matter of urgency. Terence McSweeney, one of those Irish people who gave their lives on hunger strike, who was the mayor of Cork and a writer and an intellectual, he wrote in his posthumously published book, Principles of Freedom, that he did what he did and he saw it through to the end. He did what he did for the truth. And the highest levels of truth for Terence McSweeney were justice, sovereignty, and freedom. So MEPs from Ireland and from elsewhere have a comparable obligation to the truth, and indeed then a comparable obligation to justice and the defence of justice. Cuba is a sovereign, democratic, independent nation whose constitution is shaped by and owned by, collectively owned by, its people, and whose guiding principle is social justice. The violator of the rights of the Cuban people is US imperialism, its ongoing economic blockade, which is not a set of sanctions because there is no international law giving legal sanction to these measures. These are solely unilateral coercive measures designed, in the words of the US administration itself, to bring about hunger for the Cuban people, to starve the Cuban people into submission. But they will not be starved into submission. And the international community, including bodies like the EU and the EU Parliament, should address the suffering caused by that blockade, not by packs of lies run by mercenaries and funded by the US. The most pressing issue facing the Cuban people today is the blockade and its dire consequences. Consequences which have been ratcheted up during a global pandemic. That is how obscene and inhumane this blockade is. So rather than pandering to the neo-fascist right in the European Parliament, all parliamentarians and indeed their constituents across the continent of Europe should, as a matter of urgency, oppose US imperialism, oppose the blockade, and finally, once and for all, get this ended and take this noose away from the neck of the Cuban people. We hope that all Irish MEPs will do the right thing and will speak out in terms of the truth and the reality of what is currently taking place in Cuba and the kinds of suffering that has been needlessly inflicted upon the Cuban people for over 60 years by the US as a collective punishment for their decision to reject tyranny and imperialism. Viva Cuba, viva la revolución cubana.